Welcome to this deep dive into one of history's most devastating events, the Black Death. Imagine a time when a deadly plague swept through Europe, leaving entire cities in ruin and claiming the lives of millions. But this was not just a pandemic. It was a turning point that reshaped society in ways we still feel today. From its origins in Asia to its spread across Europe, the Black Death altered the course of history forever. Stick with us as we explore the terrifying impact of the plague, the social upheaval it caused, and how it laid the foundation for the world we live in now. Let us unravel the story of the Black Death together. What if I told you that one single event in history sparked a transformation so powerful that its effects are still felt today? The Black Death was not just a plague, it was a force of nature that upended entire societies. Picture this. It is 1347, and a deadly shadow begins to creep across Europe, changing everything in its wake. Get ready to uncover how this catastrophic event reshaped the world as we know it. Let us step back in time to when everything changed forever. The year was 1347, and Europe was a land filled with bustling towns, vibrant trade routes, and an era of prosperity that many believed would never end. However, deep in the heart of Asia, something ominous was brewing. In the vast steppes of Mongolia, a deadly force was preparing to embark on a journey that would alter the course of history forever. The Black Death was on the move. It all started in the port city of Kaffa, situated on the Crimean Peninsula, a place where merchants from the east and west met to exchange goods. Genoese traders, who had long traveled the Silk Road, were the first to encounter this new mysterious plague. At the time, no one could have imagined that the disease would set sail on their ships, leaving behind a trail of devastation that would stretch across continents. Kaffa, a city known for its thriving trade and multicultural population, had become a hotspot for the plague. It was during a brutal siege by the Mongols that the first signs of the deadly disease began to appear. As the siege dragged on for months, the Mongol forces found themselves desperate. With no way to break through the city's defenses, they resorted to a horrifying tactic, catapulting the bodies of the plague ridden dead over the city walls. The infected corpses became a grim delivery system for the plague, introducing it to the unsuspecting Genoese traders within. By the time the siege ended, the traders had unknowingly carried the plague back to their homeland. The disease spread rapidly, first infecting the Genoese port cities of Sicily, then racing along the trade routes through the Mediterranean. It was not long before the plague reached the heart of Europe, a journey facilitated by the very vessels that had once carried goods and people in peace. The Black Death did not arrive quietly. It arrived with a roar, carried by rats that scurried across decks and into every corner of the cities. The rats, hosting fleas infected with the Yersinia pestis bacteria, became unwitting vectors for the disease. And soon, the fleas hopped from rat to human, transmitting the deadly bacteria to anyone in their path. As the disease spread across Europe, fear took hold of every corner of the continent. The plague moved with terrifying speed, decimating towns, cities, and villages alike. In England, it first struck the southern coastal areas where the merchant ships had docked, before sweeping north and west. Within weeks, it was in London. Within months, it had claimed a staggering portion of the population. The speed of its spread was almost supernatural. The once thriving marketplaces where merchants had bartered goods from all corners of the world were now empty. Streets that had been teeming with life were now eerily quiet, their cobblestones stained with the remnants of human suffering. The air, once filled with the scents of fresh bread and ripe fruits, now carried a stench of death that could not be ignored. This was just the beginning. The Black Death, now on its relentless march across Europe, had already started its devastating work. But the question remained, how had a disease from distant lands managed to wreak such havoc on a continent that had once seemed invincible? In the quiet aftermath, as people tried to make sense of the chaos, One thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same again. The plague had come to Europe like an unstoppable wave, crashing over the land and claiming the lives of millions. The world was about to be introduced to a terror like no other, and it did not take long for the horrors of the Black Death to become apparent. In the early days, no one knew exactly what to expect. It was not until the first victims fell ill that the true terror of the disease began to reveal itself. It started with a fever, an intense heat that seemed to burn from the inside out. People would fall ill so suddenly that one moment they could be going about their daily tasks, and the next they would be writhing in pain. But the fever was not the worst of it. Far more frightening were the grotesque lumps that began to appear on the body. It was not unusual for people to develop swollen, painful lymph nodes, known as buboes, in the groin, armpits, or neck. These lumps were like nothing anyone had ever seen before: swollen, tender, and sometimes as large as an apple. They grew rapidly and were often black or purple, giving the disease its notorious name, the Black Death. As the buboes grew, the pain intensified. The skin around them turned dark, and a strange, foul odor filled the air. Those who were unlucky enough to fall victim to the plague would find themselves helpless, watching as the disease spread through their body like wildfire. For those unlucky enough to endure the illness, death came quickly. The mortality rate was horrifying. More than 80% of those who contracted the disease and did not receive treatment died within days, sometimes as little as 3 days. No one knew why, but it seemed as though the Black Death could take a life in the blink of an eye. As the disease spread, the effects on the body became more severe. The infected would suffer from uncontrollable vomiting, dizziness, and painful headaches that seemed to last for hours. Some victims would experience severe abdominal pain, their insides seemingly twisted in agony. The dark marks that appeared on the skin were not only signs of infection, but also signs of internal bleeding, and those who had them often succumbed to shock before they could even comprehend the gravity of their situation. It was not just the pain that made the plague so terrifying. It was the speed with which it worked. People who had seemed healthy the day before were suddenly bedridden, their bodies twisted and ravaged by the plague. Within hours, a person could go from feeling feverish to being on the verge of death. In many cases, victims did not have a chance to say goodbye. Loved ones watched in horror as family members, friends, and neighbors fell one by one, sometimes without ever fully understanding what had happened to them. The terrifying speed of the Black Death left entire communities helpless. In some cases, a person would die before anyone even had a chance to notice their symptoms. They would simply collapse in the street, their body twitching and convulsing before giving way to death. And then there was the constant sense of impending doom. As the plague moved through cities and towns, the air became thick with the stench of death. Infected bodies lay abandoned in homes, sometimes for days, as people feared the very sight of illness. In some places, entire families were wiped out overnight. The number of deaths was staggering, and the streets were filled with the bodies of the fallen. People who were too sick to even move would often beg for help, only to be ignored in the chaos. As the plague continued to spread, society began to break down. Towns and villages became ghostly shells of their former selves, with only a handful of survivors left to pick up the pieces. With the death toll rising by the day, those who remained had no idea how to stop the plague, or even how to protect themselves from it. The simple act of touching something, an infected garment, a piece of food, or even another person could be enough to seal a person's fate. And so, as the world descended into darkness, people turned to whatever means they could find for survival. Some sought solace in religion, others in superstition, but no one could escape the grim reality. The Black Death was a force that would forever change the world. And for those who lived through it, the memories of the suffering The fear and the loss would linger long after the last of the plague's victims had perished. As the Black Death spread its relentless grip across Europe, it did not just take lives, it shattered the very fabric of society. The plague's wrath went beyond sickness and death. It also dismantled economies, tore apart social structures, and forever altered the world's power dynamics. The cities that had once been centers of trade, culture, and innovation now became hollow shells of their former selves. In the heart of the chaos, the streets of cities like Florence, London, and Paris had emptied. Merchants, artisans, and laborers who had once thrived were now either dead or too fearful to return to their work. The bustling markets, which had once seen the exchange of precious goods from all over the world, were now silent. Shops stood shuttered, their owners dead, or hiding from the deadly contagion. Entire families, whole neighborhoods, and communities had been wiped out, leaving vast swaths of land and property abandoned. The economic impact was immediate and devastating. With so many workers lost to the plague, the economy struggled to function. Fields lay untended, crops rotted in the ground, and trade came to a screeching halt. The cities that had once thrived on the movement of goods and people now stood still, as merchants could not risk traveling and laborers could no longer tend to their work. Without a workforce, the production of goods slowed, and the labor supply for everything from farming to manufacturing dried up. As the population dwindled, labor became increasingly scarce. But this scarcity was not just a tragedy. It was an opportunity for the survivors. The death toll had created a shift in the balance of power between the rich and the poor. The working classes, who had once been at the mercy of the wealthy, suddenly found themselves in a stronger bargaining position. With so many people dead, those who remained had more leverage than ever before. In England, for example, the wage demands of laborers skyrocketed. The people who worked the land, once forced to live under harsh conditions and low wages, now had the upper hand. They could demand more from landowners, and landowners, desperate for workers, were forced to agree. This shift in power caused friction, and soon there were murmurs of rebellion in the streets. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England was one of the first signs of the deep social unrest caused by the plague. With wages higher than ever before, and the power of the lower classes on the rise, the traditional feudal system began to unravel. The workers were no longer content to be exploited by the aristocracy. They demanded better living conditions, higher wages, and fairer treatment. The ruling classes, terrified by the newfound power of the common people, cracked down on the revolts, but the tensions had been set in motion. The social order was no longer the same. While the economic landscape was changing, so too was the structure of society. The Black Death did not just alter the wealth distribution, it also reshaped family life, religious practices, and the role of the church. Families that had once lived together in tightly knit communities found themselves scattered and broken. Whole generations were wiped out in a matter of months, leaving children orphaned and elderly people abandoned. In rural areas where the impact of the plague was especially harsh, villages were completely depopulated. Farmers fled their homes, and entire regions were left to rot as crops were left untended and livestock perished. The once bustling countryside, a place of pastoral beauty, became a place of abandonment and death. Even those who survived the plague were left with the scars of its aftermath. Those who had once been part of the elite were now finding themselves without workers, struggling to maintain their estates. The rich, who had once lived comfortably in large homes, now faced economic collapse. Their land, too vast to manage on their own, remained untended, its wealth slipping away. The power of the old aristocracy was slipping from their hands, and in its place, a new social order began to take shape. The shift from a feudal system to one that offered more mobility for the common people marked a huge social change. What was once a rigid system of lords and serfs now began to crumble under the weight of the plague's consequences. People were no longer willing to accept the status quo. They wanted more freedom, more opportunity, and more control over their own lives. But while the lower classes found strength in numbers, the upper classes responded with fear. They saw their power slipping away and feared a world where the peasants and workers could rise against them. The Black Death had irrevocably changed the social structure, and the effects would be felt for generations. As the plague ravaged the streets and left destruction in its wake, something even more profound began to shift in the hearts and minds of the people. It was not just the devastation of their daily lives or the loss of loved ones that struck at their core. It was the questions that the Black Death left behind. Why had this happened? What had caused such a wrath to be unleashed upon the world? And most terrifying of all, where was God in all of this? In a time when religion was the foundation of every aspect of life, the plague's sudden and brutal appearance sparked a crisis of faith that would send shockwaves through the very fabric of medieval Europe. People turned to religion, as they always had in times of despair, but this time there was no comfort. No priest, no holy book, no prayer seemed to offer any answers. The church, which had long been the guiding light for millions of Europeans, suddenly found itself powerless in the face of this overwhelming force of death. As monasteries and churches fell silent, with the deaths of monks and priests, many began to question why the very institution meant to protect and guide them could offer no protection against this terrible scourge. The faith that had once been a comfort now felt distant and ineffective. In the cities, as the death toll mounted, an eerie silence settled over the once bustling congregations. The monasteries, which had been filled with the sounds of prayer and reflection, were now abandoned as their occupants succumbed to the plague. In many places, entire monastic communities were wiped out. The shortage of clergy became so severe that new colleges were established, and the training of new priests was expedited to fill the gap. But despite this, the sense of loss within the church was undeniable. For many, the plague became a symbol of divine wrath. It was God's punishment for the sins of mankind, a view that gained traction as the toll of death became impossible to ignore. A movement known as the flagellants took root in many parts of Europe, their members believing that self-inflicted punishment was the only way to appease God and end the suffering. These men and women would march from town to town, whipping themselves in public displays of devotion, hoping to rid themselves of the plague's curse. The streets echoed with the sound of their chants and the crack of their whips as they prayed for divine forgiveness. They believed that by punishing themselves, they could somehow avert the wrath of God and stop the plague from claiming more lives. But not everyone agreed with the flagellants' method of atonement. Church leaders were alarmed by this movement, fearing that it was a challenge to their authority. The church had long been the arbiter of faith and redemption, and the idea of ordinary people taking matters of divine punishment into their own hands was seen as a dangerous act of defiance. In some areas, the flagellants were met with hostility, and authorities banned their processions, but the movement continued to grow, fueled by the desperation and fear that gripped Europe. Even as the flagellants marched through towns, another form of religious movement took hold in the wake of the plague. People began to seek solace in private acts of faith prayers, pilgrimages, and the belief that relics of saints or holy objects might offer protection from the disease. Across Europe, sacred relics, such as pieces of the true cross or bones of saints, were paraded through towns in the hopes of warding off the plague. But for all the devotion, no one seemed able to halt the plague's rampage. Meanwhile, the power of the church itself began to waver. The Black Death revealed the church's vulnerability, and many began to question the ability of the clergy to provide answers. As families were torn apart and the suffering became unbearable, the rich and the poor alike began to feel disillusioned with the idea of divine retribution. Some saw the church's inability to offer a solution as a sign of its own corruption, while others turned to more radical spiritual ideas that rejected the traditional structure of organized religion. As the plague continued to spread, Europe found itself caught between two conflicting worlds. The old religious order, with its emphasis on penance, devotion, and divine punishment, was no longer enough to comfort a shattered population. But as the plague raged on, a new, more personal understanding of faith began to emerge. People started to take their fate into their own hands, seeking individual forms of salvation rather than relying solely on the church. The sense of divine punishment gave way to a more human understanding of suffering, and people began to look for ways to survive and rebuild their shattered lives. The aftermath of the Black Death would leave scars on Europe's religious landscape. The church, once a symbol of unshakable authority, would never be the same. The seeds of reform had been planted, and, in the years to come, the dissatisfaction with the church's response to the plague would give rise to movements that would ultimately change the course of European history. But for now, the people of Europe were left to grapple with the most fundamental of questions. Why had this happened? And how could they ever find peace again? In the silence that followed the death toll, the question of faith lingered in the air. The Black Death had shown the frailty of humanity and the limits of religious authority, and the search for answers would continue, long after the last of the plague's victims had been buried. The plague had passed through Europe like a great storm, leaving behind a wake of devastation that no one could have imagined. But just as the waves of the Black Death receded, something extraordinary began to take shape beneath the surface. Europe, though broken and battered, would not remain in ruins forever. Slowly, the regions that had been devastated by death and disease began to rebuild, sometimes through sheer will, sometimes out of necessity, but always with a sense of resilience that would define the future. In the years following the Black Death, the true depth of the catastrophe became clearer. The population of Europe had been reduced by as much as 1/3, and in some areas, even more. Towns that had once thrived with life now stood nearly empty. Entire villages were abandoned, their fields left untended, and their houses in ruins. The once vibrant markets, which had bustled with traders from every corner of the world, were now mere shadows of their former selves. But what seemed like the end was, in fact, just the beginning of a new era. The first signs of recovery came slowly. With so many people dead, the labor force had been severely depleted. Fields lay fallow, businesses shuttered, and cities once filled with noise and activity became eerily quiet. But for those who survived, the world suddenly held opportunities that had never existed before. With fewer workers to fill the necessary jobs, the value of labor soared. Those who had been poor, working the land for meager wages, suddenly found themselves in demand. They could now negotiate for better pay, better living conditions, and more respect. This shift in the balance of power was one of the most profound legacies of the Black Death. For centuries, Europe had been governed by a rigid social hierarchy where the wealthy landowners and nobles controlled most of the wealth, and the peasant class had little power. But after the plague, things began to change. The working classes now had bargaining power they had never dreamed of before. They could demand higher wages, better living conditions, and in some cases even more autonomy. The feudal system that had dominated for so long began to show cracks, and though the nobility fought to maintain their control, the age of feudalism was on its way out, giving way to a more modern and fluid society. The rise in wages and the increased demand for workers also led to the transformation of Europe's economy. The labor shortage forced landowners to find new ways to maintain their estates. Some turned to new agricultural techniques, increasing efficiency, while others invested in new industries and urban centers that would eventually give rise to the early stages of capitalism. The breakdown of the old feudal system laid the groundwork for the rise of a new economic order, one based less on inherited land and more on industry, trade, and commerce. But the Black Death did more than just shift the economy. It also changed the very fabric of society. As the population had dwindled, the surviving Europeans found themselves facing a new social order. With fewer people around, it was easier for individuals to move around, to leave their homes and seek new opportunities. The rigid boundaries that once separated the classes began to soften. A new merchant class began to emerge, made up of those who had previously been peasants or artisans, but who now had the opportunity to make their own fortunes in the wake of the plague's destruction. Towns that had once been small and isolated grew into bustling centers of trade and commerce. Cities like Florence, Venice, and London began to attract a new class of professionals, craftsmen, and merchants. These cities would become the heart of the Renaissance, the era that would redefine Europe in the centuries to come. And though the Black Death had taken a terrible toll, it also set the stage for a flourishing of art, culture, and intellect that would shape the modern world. Perhaps the most surprising legacy of the Black Death was the profound impact it had on science and medicine. For centuries, medical knowledge had been based on ancient texts and religious teachings, with little understanding of how disease spread nor how the human body worked. But the catastrophic effects of the plague forced Europe to look at the world in new ways. Medical practitioners, desperate to understand the cause of the disease and how it spread, began to challenge old assumptions and ask new questions. While the medical community did not yet understand the true cause of the plague Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible, it did begin to develop some new practices that would help combat future outbreaks. Quarantines, for example, were first implemented during the Black Death as cities and towns isolated the sick to prevent further spread. Public health measures like these would eventually form the foundation for modern medicine, which would continue to evolve throughout the Renaissance and beyond. But the plague did not just affect the physical world, it also shaped the spiritual and cultural landscape of Europe. The sheer scale of the tragedy left people searching for meaning in the midst of unimaginable suffering. Some turned to the church for answers, but many began to question their faith. The church, unable to provide protection from the plague, saw its authority weakened. In the years that followed, new religious movements arose, including those calling for reform within the church itself. The dissatisfaction that simmered during and after the Black Death would eventually give rise to the Protestant Reformation, a movement that would split the church in two and lead to centuries of religious conflict across Europe. As people began to rebuild their lives, they did not simply return to the old ways. The Black Death had created cracks in the established order, and those cracks would only continue to widen. New forms of government, new systems of commerce, and new ways of thinking would emerge from the ashes of the old world. The recovery from the plague was slow, but it laid the foundation for a society that would be more dynamic, more interconnected, and more complex than anything that had come before it. The Black Death was a cataclysmic event that changed the course of history. It was a tragedy that cost millions of lives, yet from the ashes of that destruction, Europe began to rebuild, stronger and more capable of adapting to the challenges of the modern world. The legacy of the Black Death is one of both loss and transformation. While it forever altered the lives of those who lived through it, it also set the stage for the future. A future that would be marked by new opportunities, new ideas, and a society that was irrevocably different from what it had been before. The Black Death, with its trail of death and despair, left an indelible mark on Europe, reshaping the continent in ways that are still visible today. The horrors of the plague were unimaginable. Whole families wiped out, cities left empty, and the social order upended. Yet, in the wake of this devastation, Europe began to rebuild, stronger and more determined than ever. However, the aftermath of the plague was not just a story of recovery, it was a profound transformation, one that would set the stage for the world we know today. As the survivors of the Black Death emerged from the wreckage, they were faced with a world that had irrevocably changed. In many ways, the plague was a reset button for Europe. For the working classes, it meant new opportunities. With fewer people to work the land, labor became a valuable commodity. Wages rose, and laborers found themselves in a position to demand better working conditions, better pay, and more control over their lives. For centuries, the feudal system had held people in rigid social positions, but the Black Death tore down those barriers. The old power structures could no longer function as they once had. In its place, a new, more flexible social and economic order began to take shape. This was a society in transition. The old feudal lords who had once held all the power now faced uprisings and demands from those they had once oppressed. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was one such manifestation of this newfound power among the lower classes. The peasants who had once been bound to the land and the will of the landowners were no longer willing to tolerate the injustice that had defined their lives. They had witnessed the brutality of the plague, the senseless deaths of so many, and they were no longer content to accept their fate. They had learned that the old rules no longer applied, and they demanded change. But the impact of the plague was not confined to the economic and social realms. The Black Death also forced Europeans to confront their beliefs and values. The Church, which had once been a pillar of strength, now appeared fragile in the face of such widespread devastation. The people had turned to the Church for answers, seeking solace in prayer and penance, but it had offered them none. Many began to question the Church's power and its inability to stop the plague. Why had God allowed such suffering? Was the Church truly the conduit to salvation, or was it simply a corrupted institution? These were questions that could not be ignored. Out of this crisis of faith came a wave of religious reform. The Black Death had shaken the foundations of medieval Christianity, and in its wake, people began to seek new answers. The flagellant movement, with its public displays of self-punishment, was one response, born from a desperate attempt to appease a seemingly wrathful God. But it was also a reflection of the broader shift in how people viewed spirituality and religion. For some, the Black Death was not a divine punishment, but a call for personal introspection and change. This spiritual upheaval would pave the way for the Protestant Reformation, a movement that would challenge the very structure of the Church itself. Figures like Martin Luther, who would later argue that salvation could be achieved through faith alone, would rise to prominence in the years following the Black Death. The rebellion against the authority of the Church that began in the wake of the plague would continue to reverberate throughout Europe, leading to profound religious and political changes that would forever alter the continent. But the Black Death's legacy was not limited to religion and politics. It also shaped the intellectual and cultural landscape of Europe. The plague, in its relentless destruction, forced people to confront the fragility of life and the impermanence of human achievement. In the aftermath, there was a deep desire for renewal, for a rebirth of culture and knowledge. This desire fueled the Renaissance, a period of intense intellectual and artistic flourishing that would transform European society. The Renaissance was, in many ways, a reaction to the devastation of the Black Death. The trauma and loss experienced during the plague created a hunger for knowledge and a renewed interest in the human experience. The arts, literature, and sciences flourished in the centuries that followed, as thinkers like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Galileo challenged the old ways of thinking and laid the groundwork for modern science and philosophy. The Renaissance was not just a rebirth of culture, it was a reflection of Europe's resilience, its ability to rise from the ashes of the Black Death and reinvent itself. As the centuries passed, the legacy of the Black Death continued to influence the course of European history. The demographic shifts caused by the plague led to long-term economic changes. The labor shortage brought about by the deaths of millions of people paved the way for the rise of capitalism, as workers gained more bargaining power and markets became more dynamic. The old feudal system, once a cornerstone of medieval society, was replaced by a more market-driven economy, with increasing emphasis on trade, industry, and commerce. At the same time, the plague's impact on religion and culture set the stage for the modern world. The rise of Protestantism, the questioning of authority, and the hunger for knowledge and personal growth laid the groundwork for the Enlightenment and the development of modern democratic ideals. The Black Death, though a tragedy of unimaginable proportions, became a catalyst for change, propelling Europe into a new age of intellectual and cultural exploration. Today, the Black Death remains one of the most studied events in history. It is a reminder of the fragility of life and the resilience of humanity. The plague's legacy is visible not only in the economic, social, and religious changes it brought about, but also in the lessons it offers us today. In times of crisis, humanity has the ability to adapt, to rebuild, and to emerge stronger than before. The Black Death, in all its horror, showed the world that even in the darkest of times, there is the potential for renewal and transformation. The echoes of that resilience still reverberate throughout history, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. As we reflect on the profound impact of the Black Death, it is impossible to ignore how the lessons from that dark period still resonate in the modern world. The plague was not just a historical tragedy. It was a turning point that forced humanity to re-examine its relationship with disease, with authority, and with each other. The pandemic revealed the frailty of human existence, but it also showed the incredible resilience of people in the face of overwhelming adversity. Today, in the face of global challenges like the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, and political unrest, we can look back at the Black Death and draw valuable lessons. The Black Death demonstrated how a single event could disrupt the very foundation of society, yet it also proved that recovery, though slow and painful, is possible. The crisis reshaped economies, altered social structures, and transformed the way people thought about religion, death, and the meaning of life. In the modern context, one of the most important lessons we can learn from the Black Death is the need for adaptability. Just as the survivors of the plague had to adapt to a world without the comforting structure they once knew, so too must we learn to adapt to new realities. The pandemic highlighted the fragility of systems, whether it be healthcare, economics, or social networks, and it showed us how quickly things can change. However, it also reminded us that we have the power to rebuild, to innovate, and to redefine what we consider normal. Another lesson from the Black Death is the importance of community and collective action. In the aftermath of the plague, people came together in new ways, forging stronger bonds with one another. The breakdown of old hierarchies and the emergence of new social and economic structures gave rise to a more interconnected society, where individual actions had greater collective consequences. In today's world, as we face challenges like climate change and global health crises, the importance of working together as a global community has never been clearer. The Black Death showed us that the survival of one is linked to the survival of all. Moreover, the Black Death was a stark reminder of the limitations of power. The Church, for all its authority, was unable to protect its followers from the plague, and in its wake, many people began to question the very systems that had once been considered unchangeable. This is a theme that continues to echo in modern society. From political systems to corporations and institutions, we are continually reminded that no authority is invincible, and that power can and should be questioned and reformed. Ultimately, the Black Death offers us more than just a glimpse into a dark chapter of history. It serves as a mirror, reflecting both our vulnerabilities and our strengths. The ways in which societies of the past responded to this catastrophe have shaped the course of history, and we too can use these lessons to guide our responses to the challenges of today and tomorrow. In every crisis, there is an opportunity for transformation, just as Europe emerged from the ashes of the Black Death to become the foundation for the Renaissance. So too can we rebuild and emerge stronger, more unified, and more resilient. As we move forward, let us not forget the lessons the Black Death taught us about human perseverance, the importance of adaptability, and the need for unity in the face of global challenges. By honoring the resilience of those who lived through the Black Death, we can create a better, more sustainable future for ourselves and for generations to come. Selves and for generations to come. Selves and for generations to come.